So welcome to the first Lunch and Learn of the new program year for the League of Women Voters of Monterey County. The first thing that you'll notice is that I'm not Tama Alver, who was elected as president for this coming year. An incredible display of transparency, the fact that the League tries to be scrupulously nonpartisan. Both the president and the voter service director have to remain free of any partisan politics, and Tama felt like she really needed to get involved in this coming election. Yes, we are having an election. So she stepped down, and they decided that they could use a retread, and so here I am back again as president. All right. Thank you. So today's speaker is Sara Rubin, who is editor of the Monterey County Weekly, and I didn't get to ask her if she's also classified as the editor of Monterey Weekly Now, the online version.
I can explain.
Okay. So she's a graduate of Colorado College. She joined the Weekly in 2010. She became editor in 2017. A website called Muck Rack, which consolidates writings of journalists, lists her as having 1,017 articles written. Ooh. So apparently she just writes all the time. From a distance, again, because I didn't get to talk to you about this, one wonders whether you have a compulsion for journalism because you joined the industry during the greatest crisis of the business model of newspapers. So it's quite a leap of faith to jump into an industry that you might think is a little bit shaky underneath your feet. So she's going to talk about local journalism, and we all well, sometimes try to avoid appearing in Squid, and so it does have quite, everybody here reads it to make sure their name isn't there. I have been in a couple of times, but that's okay. Sarah, please come up.
Thank you all so much, and I just want to say thank you to the League of Women Voters for doing everything that you do, and so much of it as far as getting information out to voters, to residents about their opportunities to engage in our democratic systems is very much aligned with what we do in the local press, and I just really value and respect what you all do, and thank you for doing it. And thank you for having me today, and happy to talk a little bit about myself in the newspaper. And then I hope you all have a lot of questions, because I would love to talk about whatever's interesting to you and whatever's on your minds, and we'll answer whatever I can. And the title for the talk about the state of the local media, I obviously know the most about the Weekly. That's what I live and breathe, so that's really what I am equipped to talk about. But to answer the question that I think our staff is still learning a little bit too. So the newspaper that publishes every Thursday is still called Monterey County Weekly. It is a weekly, it comes out once a week. And tomorrow's paper went to print, half of it last night, half of it this morning, and it's already been printed, I presume, and is probably getting loaded onto a truck roughly right about now, and will get delivered to our office in Seaside this afternoon, and then drivers will come and pick it up and deliver it all over Monterey County. And then our digital properties, which are increasingly a big part of what we do and how we are reaching readers, we now call Monterey County Now. So the website is montereycountynow.com. Our newsletter that we send out by email every day is part of Monterey County Now. Everything you see online, Monterey County Now, is what it is. So I hope that makes sense. I'm working on my own explanation. We're learning. a new branding definition kind of thing, trying to distinguish between print and web. But that's maybe a good place for me to start, is just by talking a little bit about state of the local media and state of our newspaper. And to Dennis's point about having a compulsion for journalism, yes, probably. I mean, I don't think you do this kind of work unless you really love it and unless you really, really care about it. We've seen a lot of print outlets close down or shrink in the time of my career and before. So I got into journalism starting in 2009 with a little bit of time dabbling in college in my college news magazine prior to that. And print continues to diminish for market reasons. Ultimately, it doesn't have anything to do with the desire of people to read the news, to get the news. So I think the fundamental principle that people want to read news that's reported thoughtfully, fact-checked, reporters have been on the ground to see things and observe things and distill some of the facts about what's happening in a community, that remains unchanged as far as I can tell. It's the delivery mechanism, how people read that content, that has changed. So we have had a digital presence at the Weekly for a very long time. I don't remember the year, but we've got some kinds of cool historical milestones that we were one of the first alt weeklies to have a website and all these things, which I probably was a little kid then. I don't know. The paper's been around for 37 years. But it was during the pandemic that we really made this fundamental shift to have an increased digital presence. And maybe I should just start by getting a show of hands. How many of you read the Weekly, the print newspaper? Oh, a lot of you. This is great. How many of you read the email newsletter? A lot of you also. So you have a sense of some of these, hopefully what feel like complementary pieces that we're publishing. And at the beginning of the pandemic, at the time, I think it's hard to put your mind back in this time when we thought it might have been 60 days, 90 days that we'd be sheltering in place. We curtailed significantly the number of issues that we printed physically because people weren't going out to pick up the paper, and also many of the establishments where we distribute the paper had shut down. So the restaurants and the cafes where you might go pick up a copy of the Weekly were not open. So we printed fewer copies, started distributing them at fewer places, pharmacies, grocery stores that were open, and we started doing this daily newsletter. And we thought, we'll reach our readers this way, virtually, everybody's at home, online. So we started doing a daily newsletter, and at the time, at least I thought, maybe we'll do this for the duration of shelter in place, a couple months. How wrong that was. And then, as things shifted, we realized that we were doing something really helpful to our readers, which was reaching them every day. A lot of the news, you're familiar with the Weekly, so you'll see a lot of the news that you read in there is not super time sensitive. If you read it, tomorrow's paper, the issue of September 12th, some of those stories, if you read them September 12th or September 15th or 16th while that paper's still on stands, will still be very relevant to you. The newsletter gives us a place where we can say, here's what's happening today, here's what's happening tomorrow, and there's a little bit more urgency. Hence this name change, Monterey County Now. And so we're trying to reflect both of these time signatures in what we do. And all the stories from the print newspaper go in the newsletter, so we're doing the both and, trying to fulfill both of these needs. The big project for us today is getting up a story about the stranded orca that was found yesterday at Carmel River State Beach. And you can be the first people to know, unfortunately, that whale died. I'm not sure, that story might not have gone up yet. I'm here, not there, so you know that before it's online. So no, KAZU does now too, so there's my friendly competition in the room. But so that obviously is a story for us for today. It will be in today's newsletter, and my team's now getting to work on next week's paper as we speak, and that is an example of a story that will probably not feel current enough to be mentioned in next Thursday's paper. So you won't see that story in our print edition based on the timing. And so I tell you all of that just to kind of give a little sense of how we're thinking and how we're operating and some of the management of these decisions and what's a story, where does it go, when do you read it, where do you read it, and in what platform. So that's perhaps a really long description of Monterey County Now versus Monterey County Weekly, same but different. But I brought a few numbers also just to share with you some of the breakdown on how, where we're reaching people the most. So pre-COVID, I think it was that we printed about 35,000 issues a week. Now we print 20,000 issues. So each of those is read by something like 2.5 people. See, I told you I had numbers, and I wrote down only a few of the numbers, so some of them I'm guessing at. But that's reaching something like 50,000 readers. And then for our newsletter, we have 35,000 subscribers. So although we're printing fewer issues, we're probably still reaching more people through our print newspaper than through our newsletter. But then we also are getting 300,000 unique page views a month on our website. So those may be some of the people who are reading us in print, some who are reading us online. I think it's a little bit hard to know those answers. The beauty of my job as the editor is that I don't have to worry and stay up at night. I have plenty of things that keep me up at night, but I am not so concerned about how do you find a way to make money with the transformation of more digital readership. And we've got an amazing sales team, really long-time salespeople who are really invested in the community, who are experimenting and figuring out ways to do that. And that's ultimately the big challenge for this industry and how local news makes it work and continues to survive. And we have a really nice, clear firewall between what the sales team is doing and what we're doing in editorial. And then we get to decide what are the stories of the day that go in our newsletter, what are the stories of the week that go in our newspaper, and send our resources out to go find those stories, report those stories, write those stories, and get them ready for print. And so with that, we actually just welcomed our newest staff member on Monday this week, and she is a California Local News Fellow. I've written a little bit about this program even before we were part of the fellowship, just because I think it's such an exciting initiative by the state. She is part of the second cohort of what is funded to be 3 cohorts of early career journalists who are getting a lot of mentorship through UC Berkeley as the state partner that's running this program, and then the newspapers that host fellows chip in a little bit towards their salary. And it's kind of an apprenticeship program to train up a new generation of journalists in California and then help newspapers like ours get more resources, because we can't afford to expand our staff to what I would, I like to tell my publisher, it's like we could double the staff and still everybody would be working full-time plus. So we're really excited to be part of this program, really excited to have Katie Rodriguez as her name, and she'll have a story about the Orca up today. She brings our team to 10 editorial staff members, which is the largest editorial department of any local news outlet in Monterey County. And I don't know exactly the configuration at any of the other outlets, but when I started at the Weekly in 2010, it was kind of a remarkable thing if we could, we compete with all the other outlets. We're trying to get the story first and better. And we increasingly, I think it feels like we can just get the story first without even thinking about the timing of the daily newspapers. It used to be a really hard thing if we were going to try to beat the Californian or the Herald, that they had teams of reporters out in the community attending city council meetings, poring over city council agendas, not just city council, water boards, school boards, all of these public agencies really paying attention. And so there was sort of this urgency all the time, and daily newspapers were covering a lot of these agencies really, really consistently. And you could, if you were interested in what the County Board of Supervisors was doing on a Tuesday at their meeting, but you couldn't attend, you could pretty reliably read about it, a summary of that meeting, in the Herald on Wednesday. They would have had a reporter in the room telling you, here's what happened. It's not really the kind of journalism that the Monterey County Weekly has tried to do. We're trying to offer some more analysis, advance these stories, give a little bit more to our readers of what does this mean, why is this important, not just here's the play-by-play, who said what. Certainly that's a part of it. But for anybody who follows other local news outlets, I think you'll find that there's just fewer reporters. So our team outnumbers the Herald. I believe now there's one new local staffer at the Salinas Californian. They've had intermittently 0 or 1 person for the past couple of years, which I know they try to hire, and they're having a hard time staffing there, and they have capacity for 1. And there's just, when I feel like with 10, we're trying to be everywhere all at once, and it feels like everybody's doing their best to get to know their beats really well, and still they cannot attend every LUAC meeting and every city council meeting and every school board meeting. It's just not possible. There's so many really meaningful, influential agencies and decisions being made in this county. And there are reporters doing great work, and really good reporters doing what they can with what they have. The Carmel Pinecone covers a really specific small area with some really good reporters, and I think a really sort of extreme editorial angle on some of their coverage. Maybe this room agrees. I thought this was a nonpartisan group. KAZU has done increasingly, I think, some really good local coverage, but also, from what I've heard, just it's a matter of staffing and how many people can you send out to tell the stories that need to be told. So it all comes down to resources for local press and for any press, really. And for us, the big resource is the people. And having a person that you can say, go spend your day in Big Sur at the Bismack meeting, maybe something interesting will happen, and maybe not, but you get to hear kind of how the sausage is made. You listen in, you meet the people who are making decisions in your community that way. Maybe it pays off and you get a story 6 months down the road you don't even know, but it's by showing up, putting in the time, building relationships, that's how you tell stories as a journalist. So ultimately it's all people power. People are expensive. There's this whole revenue problem. There's this transition to digital. And it's all happening at a time that I think we all know we need more information, not less. We need better information. We need it from credible sources. And did everybody see probably, the Taylor Swift endorsement of Kamala Harris? My perhaps very controversial confession is that I really don't like her music. But I thought 1989 was a great album. It's been downhill from there. But I loved what she said, because it was not about persuading people to vote the way she intends to vote. It was about encouraging people to go get credible information, to question if what they have heard or seen is in fact misinformation, and then to go use factual data that they gather themselves and filter through their own brain and their own heart and their own value system to make their own choice. And I just give her a lot of credit for that. I thought it was really beautifully executed by her, and I don't know if she writes her own Instagram or if somebody else does, but whoever did it, maybe her, I really, really respected that framing. And the challenge becomes, and I hear about this from, all the time from my parents who live in a small town in New Jersey where I grew up, that they wish, and they read the Monterey County Now newsletter, even though they don't live here, but that they wish that they had a place to go where somebody would tell them, here's what their city council or their county board of supervisors or their county sheriff is doing. They have no idea. They have a lot of places that they can go to read about what the Biden-Harris administration is doing, a lot of places they can go to read about the war in Ukraine and Israel-Gaza. There are a lot of resources covering national and international news. There's no shortage. They, in fact, have a lot of choices. But when they want to know what's happening in their own town, they have seen the company that owns their local paper is the same company that owns the Salinas Californian, and it's experienced the same kind of gutting of staff. So there is no local staff member at a newspaper out covering all of those local events. I think Monterey County has, despite the diminished size of some of the staff at our competitors, a lot of local newspapers, a lot of local news outlets. I keep saying newspapers, but we also have radio, we have television. And I'm really proud that the Weekly has in fact been able to grow our staff during a really tough time. Some of it is going all in on the digital front, keeping print alive, doing both at once. Some of it is that we've done this very direct appeal to our readers and said, hey, please, we give everything, we publish everything for free, please consider giving us money. And a lot of people have done that, and so that has really helped stabilize, during a really unstable time, our business model. So that's fundamentally, the money in translates to reporters, and that translates to people out in the community telling stories. So that's kind of my attempt to tell you the business story of local media. There's lots of other things I can talk about, but maybe I should just do questions. I don't know. Then I could be more specific, perhaps, instead of ramble.
Thank you. All right, do we have any questions for Sara? Brian, you must have some questions. No. This is Brian Thayer. Right. Your husband?
That's funny because Brian always makes dinner, so I don't actually know. It's up to him. But I will give Brian credit for, we do a thing at the Weekly that we just revived today. We've been a little lackadaisical about it, but we have a challenge word, and it sometimes takes months to get the challenge word. It's like a vocab word that's a little tough, and then the staff is challenged to include it in a story. It has to fit, it has to make sense, depending on how obscure it is. And then sometimes your editor comes along with a red pen and says it just doesn't work. You're just trying to meet the challenge, and that's not going to work. And Brian has come up with a few challenge words for us. Hi, Margie.
I've known Sara when she first started working at the Weekly, so thank you for sticking with it, and congratulations on being editor. So I've been a long-time reader, and I remember it was the Monterey Coast Weekly, and the one question I have is, when there is possibly an error in an article, what's your policy on corrections? Because I know it's a print, and you can't always, change the print, and it's only weekly. So I'm just curious on what's the reception on receiving and making corrections when it's needed, and what do you see as the future of the paper?
Both great questions, thank you. We strive to be 100% accurate. That's the expectation of our team. We obviously do not always achieve that, and if we've made an error, it's very important to us to fix the error right away. So if any of you ever sees an error in the paper, please tell us. Obviously we don't know it's there, we've sent it out to print. If it's a small typo, like we've got the wrong, say we've misspelled somebody's first name on one reference, we will fix that online. We always note the correction in the online version, because I think it's important to create a record of what it used to say versus what it says now. I know different outlets have different policies about that, but if we've changed a story after publication, you should always see a note that says, we spelled Margie K wrong, here's how it was first, we've updated it, that here's the correct spelling. If it's a small thing like that, we will probably just note that online. If it's a more substantive error, we will then not only note that in the online version that still has a life and keeps circulating. So I think it's incredibly important to do this in the online version right away. If it's been in print, we will also follow up with a correction in the print newspaper the next week. And those corrections always go in the same place in our letters section, so people know to look there. We don't have corrections most weeks, luckily. Sometimes we do, and then we try to carefully say, here's what we got wrong, here's what's right. So that's our policy, and if it's a matter of, well, we just disagree, it's not a factual error, then we don't run a correction. Then we say, go ahead and post a comment, write a letter to the editor. You thought it was a bad story, that we shouldn't have covered it, or that we had the wrong idea or takeaway about it, and that's okay. We can have a difference of opinion, and you can write in your opinion, and we'll publish it. It's only for things that are factually inaccurate that we will run a correction. But we take it very seriously, and we do. And if we find out 5 years later that we ran a factual error, we're not going to run a print correction then, because it's not really referencing anything. But we will still correct the online version of that story. As to what the future holds, I think it's a great question, and I think that we see that people really care about local news, want local news, if anything, want more local news. And there's just enough interesting happenings in this community. And I don't know, I always say I don't have experience being a local journalist in any other community, so I can't really compare if our community is just more interesting and rich and there's all this stuff happening all the time compared to other places, or any place might be this interesting if you were a local journalist trying to dive in and peel back the layers. But I think Monterey County needs a good, robust local press. There's so many great, really uplifting stories to tell. There's so many government agencies making so many consequential decisions, and no regular person can reasonably be expected to follow along all of these decisions and happenings or pay attention to all of the elections. It's just a lot of information to sift through. So I think the need is absolutely there. The demand is absolutely there. What does the future business model look like? It's hard for me to imagine it looking that different than what we have today, probably a mix of digital and print. And we, from a business standpoint, we still get most of our revenue from print. That's the old way it's always been, and it is the way it still is now. We publish a bunch of glossy magazines that help bring in more revenue, and that I foresee continuing. Those are sort of more durable than the weekly paper, and they're meant to kind of distribute at a hotel for a whole year, things like that. So I think that mix and match of direct reader support, print publications, including those glossies, plus the digital side is probably, that mix may change of where the revenue comes from and where maybe the most resources are. Like, I could see that if we could, we might expand our digital staff a little bit, have somebody more dedicated to social media. We have a lot of, do you call them readers? I don't know. People who are consuming what we publish just on Instagram, but nowhere else. Maybe aren't reading our newspaper, even realize that it's a newspaper. But if that's where people are getting information, I think it's important that we're reaching them there and giving the same kind of care and thoughtfulness to that format. So I don't know, I think some updates, but I don't foresee like reinventing the wheel. So I don't know if that answers your question. Janet?
One of the situations that has changed over the last few years is the fact that many local agencies you can now access online, and you don't have to attend a meeting. How has that affected your reporting?
That's a great question, and this is something we talk about a lot, actually. It has made it much easier and convenient for reporters to cover agencies that meet digitally. I highly recommend that if you're going to tune into the Democratic County Party meetings, or the Democratic Party Monterey County Central Committee, I'm mixing up the name, George knows it because he's endured these, but it's like best done at home with a stiff drink. And those meetings aren't happening in person anymore anyway. It used to be that if you wanted to hear the deliberations about who they're going to endorse, you had to be in the room. There was no audio or video produced, so either you show up or you miss it. Now you watch the Zoom, and that's where the deliberation happens. And our production cycle means that we have a really busy day on Tuesdays at the paper, and we're copy editing whatever is not yet finalized and getting it ready to go to print. It's hard to get somebody to the Board of Supervisors meeting because we're just, on urgent deadline at that time, and the fact that it's all on video means somebody can watch it the next week. They can watch it from their couch in the evening. There's a certain amount of convenience. So it enables us, it creates a record that enables us to watch and listen from anywhere, anytime. You can go back and hear what somebody said at a meeting 3 years ago in some cases, which I think is great. And I think it's excellent that we keep this going as a tool for public participation. I think it's really important for reporters to show up, be in person, make eye contact. And I think this is part of what is really meaningful about local media as opposed to, you hear the term parachute journalists. People who don't know the community, don't live here, don't have to show up and face the people they write about. There's a certain amount of accountability when you're sitting there eye to eye with the people that you're writing about. And so that's one piece of it. And then, there's accountability that comes in all sorts of different ways. Like you run into the people you've written about at the grocery store, at the park. Sometimes once somebody approached me while I was mid-changing at the Monterey Sports Center, which I don't recommend ever approaching anybody in that moment. It's just weird, but I wanted to talk about desalination. I'm like, this is just not the time. But you see people in even vulnerable moments like that, like bathing suit, half on, in the locker room, and people recognize you, want to talk to you, but they only recognize you if you've been out in the community meeting people. And I also think just for the journalist, there is no substitute for being in the room. You see all kinds of body language. You see the things happening that are not in the video field on the dais, some of which are consequential and important. Sometimes that's where the real story is. Are there 100 sheriff's deputies in the room for the budget hearing? That's interesting in and of itself. And only 2 people from the department are going to get up and make their little presentation. And I don't mean that in a diminishing way. It's just there's more to even some of the most bureaucratic stories sometimes than you can capture just from the video of a meeting.
Sara, what do you think is the future of nonprofit journalism? For example, we have Voices of Monterey Bay, which had a good start and seems to be faltering. We have K-Squid, the successor to KUSP. We have KAZU. I know that some years ago when the newspapers were really starting to be taken over by the hedge funds, a foundation was formed and endowed in St. Petersburg, Florida, so that they could continue to publish their daily newspaper in a nonprofit way. So I'm wondering if you see that as part of the picture, and if so, what part?
Thanks, Beverly. That's a good question, too. And I agree. I don't really know. Voices of Monterey Bay, I think, was relying a lot on just volunteer energy, and that, I think, really excellent journalists, but there's perhaps a more finite amount of volunteer energy than people think there's going to be sometimes. I mean, this is a group that relies on volunteer energy, and you guys are going strong, so maybe that's not true. But it's really hard work to do journalism and keep producing journalism. And then there are occasional legal challenges where you need, good insurance and you need a good lawyer. And even if you're totally right, somebody can sue you for something that they don't like, and it's really expensive and you have to deal with it. And so I think when you're relying on volunteers, you can kind of run out of steam. There are fun parts, but then there are just some trying parts of the work. So I think it's helpful to have a paid staff, not a volunteer staff. I think that's kind of critical at all levels, not just your writers and photographers and your editors, but the business side of it, the people who are making your website, who are fixing things. I think that fundamentally is a critical step, and Voices of Monterey Bay has been paying their contributors, certainly. I don't mean to suggest they haven't. I think their leadership was volunteering a lot of time. And I don't know exactly why it's run out of steam. But there are a lot of really good nonprofit journalism outlets. ProPublica does great work, is just one example. But I think probably there are some of the same challenges. You got to go find money. So you need, instead of maybe a sales department, you have a development department, and they'd have to be really good, and then they have to get creative, and there's something you think will work out and it doesn't. And I don't know, Brian could maybe answer this question better. He's a nonprofit professional. So I'm not sure that, I think it's part of the ecosystem, certainly, but I'm not sure that it's a replacement for, our case is really special in that we have local ownership. The founder and CEO, Bradley Zeev, created this newspaper. He bought it when it was small. He lives in Carmel Valley. He's a stakeholder in this community too, and he really cares about having a good local newspaper, and he's not a hedge fund, and he's a regular person. So I think that kind of model, this very old school, small-time business person who is a community member owning the media outlets, is a great model. It's the model that I live by, and it has worked for me really well. So I am biased perhaps towards what I have, but I like that we have an owner who you can call him and complain to him, and he will listen to you, and he might not agree with you, but he will listen. And to me, that's a good concept. I also think it's hard. Like any business, owning any small business is risky. So I'm not sure that there's going to be more nonprofits or more small-time people willing to take that kind of risk. I don't know, but there are people doing it. I'm really excited about this idea of some government funding for journalism. I think the recognition by the state of California that this is a real value for making government work, and that there's more to it than just, in the state you think about, well, yeah, you can watch the video of every assembly committee and Senate committee, and if you have 8 hours and you want to watch the whole thing, sure, it's all available to you. But the idea that there are journalists helping distill it, make sense of it, I think is state lawmakers are recognizing this is a value, we should uphold it, we should invest in it. So the California Local News Fellowship, I think, is really exciting. I'm really disappointed that the legislature backed down on, what's been called a link tax, this idea that Google and search engines would pay outlets based on using their content, which they, put out there for free, and then they make a lot of money on it. I hope that there's an opportunity in the future to revisit that. I think that's the kind of thing that could transform the possibility. And it might then make it more enticing for people to say, well, I'm going to start a newspaper, I'm going to buy a newspaper, buy the Herald. And even though it's risky, at least there's some money to be made. I think it's also just basic fairness. So I hope that changes.
Well, I'm sure you have enormous discussions about what to feature 2 weeks out, 4 weeks out, 6 weeks out, and so on. I'm sure that takes a lot of time and a lot of sorting out of ideas and so on. I'm curious a little more about do you have any strategic discussions about things that need to be covered and you look for stories or application of kind of principles that are at play? I'm particularly thinking about climate change and how do you address it if things aren't happening? But I'm just curious about what kind of strategic discussions in that kind of larger scale of subject matter that takes place within staff or within the management structure.
That's a great question, and in a lot of ways, that is the most involved part of my job. It's like I get the fun role, and there are 2 deputy editors who manage other sections, but we spend a lot of time talking about what to cover, how much to cover it, how much space are we going to give it, where are we going to cover it? Are we going to put this in the opinion section or the news section? Will it go only online? Some of it has to do with timing. But ultimately, we're trying to find a good balance of our subject matter and do our best to fan out across our entire coverage area. So if we realize that we haven't done a story about Pacific Grove in a little while, but we've been doing a lot of Salinas, we want to make sure that we reflect both of those places. And this is both in a given issue, so that we don't have, 4 stories and our arts and culture is all about things happening in the city of Monterey, but what about Marina and, Big Sur, and try to make sure that we're getting some diversity of geography, diversity of subject matter. And sometimes there will be a big story that is going to be in the paper week after week. So it's by issue, and then it's also over time. And if we cover, shows at Sunset Center 4 weeks in a row in our art section, well, let's do our part to go find other venues that are doing great things. Maybe they have really great programs 4 weeks in a row, but to make an effort to capture some of the diversity of place and topic in the paper. And then every reporter has a list of beats that they cover. And because 10 is our biggest staff ever that we have now, but still it means that everybody's covering 7 or 8 or 9 beats. So they might be keeping up with, all of South County and Marina and Salinas, for example, plus a number of subject matter beats, K-12 and higher education. That's Celia Jimenez. And so she can't possibly do a story about all 7 of those things in 1 week. So we do a little kind of inventory of when's the last time you did a story about X or Y, and make sure that we're covering it if we haven't. And often the stories present themselves, and there is some urgency. Pam Marino covers a lot of beats also, and that includes healthcare. She's done a lot of healthcare stories lately, and I think some of the best happening in the state of California. It's this new board, the Office of Healthcare Accountability, is really important, and Pam understands it as well as anybody in the world, I'd say. And she has put a lot of energy into that because that is at a sort of a watershed moment. And then, she gets to take a breath and think, well, have I neglected another beat? Maybe there's something important happening in another city that I cover that I couldn't pay attention to. So that's where it feels kind of quiet and like nothing's happening. When you have those moments to pause, you might realize I should check in and figure out what I missed. And there's always something. That's the thing. And I think you see it with like a hyper-local outlet like the Pinecone. We don't have a story about Carmel or Pacific Grove every week. We're also trying to choose the stories that are going to be of interest to a more general readership in Monterey County. So what's the story about Carmel that might also matter to somebody who lives in Gonzales, not just somebody who lives in Carmel? What's the story about Big Sur that's going to be interesting to someone who lives in Salinas and isn't a hiker, but might care about what's going on there? So there's a little bit of a different kind of criteria for what's going to make it into our paper. If we were trying to reach just Carmel readers or just Salinas readers, I think you can get a little bit more hyper-local in what you're selecting, because then it's more of a block-to-block neighborhood scale. But ultimately, and this is maybe a good place for me to end, is we're really reliant on sources, people in the community, to tell us what's interesting. So anybody can be a source. You don't have to be a government agency whistleblower with a big stash of documents, although if you have that, we'd love it, we welcome it. You might just know that your neighbor is doing a really cool thing to fix sidewalks in your neighborhood where they've been a problem, or whatever's going on. So anybody in this room, or your neighbors, or whoever you meet who has ideas, if you think we haven't covered it or we should know, call us. Margie knows exactly how to do this. Although she never pitched the story about herself, so we had to kind of triangulate to get there to North County litter abatement, but we got there.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We will see everybody in October for pros and cons. Thank you for coming.